On February 16, 1942, a small airplane was preparing to take off from an airfield in Stalinoabad. There were 7 people on board, each of them anxiously and hopefully awaiting the start of the flight. The pilot was Vasily Knyazhnichenko, an experienced aviator who had flown this route many times before. Among his passengers that day were 6 people, including Anna Gureeva with her 2 sons. They were heading to Khorog, a small town in a mountainous area where winter ruled. The weather was not promising. Thick clouds hung over the mountains, and the wind was strengthening. However, the flight was scheduled, and no one could cancel it due to nature's whims. The Pamir Mountains-majestic and formidable, beckoned with their beauty, but at the same time, they were treacherous and unpredictable. Anna Gureeva, looking out the airplane window at the receding horizon, held little Sasha tightly to her, who anxiously fidgeted with her fingers. The plane slowly gained altitude, and soon Stalinoabad was left far behind, shrouded in a snowy haze. The passengers immersed themselves in their thoughts, trying to distract themselves from the growing anxiety. They understood that flying over the Pamir required the pilot's utmost concentration and skill. Vasily Knyazhnichenko, with his hands on the controls, peered into the distance, trying to detect the slightest changes in the weather. About an hour into the flight passed peacefully, but when the plane reached the mountains, everything changed abruptly. Knyazhnichenko noticed how the sky began to darken rapidly, and dense clouds enveloped the mountain peaks. He knew that to cross the Pamir, they had to pass through the gates, a narrow pass between the cliffs which required precision and composure. But the weather suddenly worsened, and visibility began to drop to 0. Knyazhnichenko tried to remain calm, but anxiety was mounting. The passengers began to feel the turbulence, and Anna instinctively held her children closer. The plane seemed to struggle against an invisible force, the wind tossing it from side to side. The plane grazed a rock, lost control, and began to plummet rapidly. The engine's roar turned into a piercing whine, and Anna closed her eyes, expecting the inevitable end. The moment seemed to last an eternity before the plane crashed into the ground. When everything went silent, an eerie stillness followed, broken only by the crackling of debris. Miraculously, all the passengers and the pilot survived, but their real ordeal was just beginning. The passengers and the pilots slowly began to regain their senses after the crash, realizing they were on the brink of life and death. Around them lay the wreckage of the plane, scattered across the snowy slope at an altitude of 4,400 meters. Taking a deep breath, Vasily Knyazhnichenko checked himself for injuries. To his surprise, he had only sustained bruises and scrapes, as had the others. Anna Gureeva slowly examined her children. Little Sasha looked frightened but physically unharmed. Valera, who was a bit older, held his mother's hand tightly, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. Grief and relief mingled in her heart. They had survived, but they were trapped in the merciless mountains. All 7 people gathered to discuss their situation. Visibility was limited. The snow blinded their eyes, and the cold penetrated their bones. They understood that they wouldn't last long here. The thin air and low temperatures were slowly killing them. Despite the horror of the situation, Vasily Knyazhnichenko tried to assume the role of leader. He was a military pilot and knew that survival in such conditions depended on organization and composure. Looking around, Knyazhnichenko realized they were on the edge of a glacier surrounded by high cliffs. Behind them was an abyss, and ahead, endless snowy expanses. He knew they urgently needed to find shelter and food, or they would all perish. Taking command, Vasily ordered everyone to gather what was left of the plane: debris, blankets, food, and anything that could help them survive. They had only meager rations left: a little butter, sausage, cheese, and 3 bottles of vodka arak. It would barely last a few days, even if they ate very sparingly. Anna wrote in her diary, We ate once a day a few grams of various products. There was no water at all. We ate snow until February 19. But what worried them most was that they had no clear idea of where they were. The map that could have helped determine their location had burned in the crash. Their only hope was to descend to the Pyansish River, which, according to Vasily, could lead them to a populated area. The pilot and Vycroft, the strongest of the passengers, decided to make the first foray. They hoped to find a path to the river and return with news of their location. The remaining passengers stayed huddled in the intact part of the fuselage, trying to stay warm and keep hope alive. Several hours passed before they heard footsteps. Knyazhnichenko and Vycroft returned, but their faces showed utter despair. They couldn't find a way out. The mountains were impassable, and all exits were blocked. Anna tried not to show her children her fear, but inside she felt a chill of terror. They were trapped on the edge of the world, and there was no help in sight. The realization that they were in a hopeless situation dawned on the passengers slowly. After the first failed attempt to find an exit to the Pyansish River, which could have led them to civilization, Knyazhnichenko and Vycroft returned, filled with despair. They knew that staying put would mean a slow death, without food, water, and losing hope with every passing hour. The remaining passengers tried to keep warm and somehow adapt to life in the icy hell. They huddled in the intact heart of the plane, sheltering from the wind and cold, but the remaining shelter was too cramped. People slept on each other's laps, trying to keep warm. The situation was becoming increasingly dire. Anna Gureeva tried not to panic for the sake of her sons. She knew that at such a high altitude and in such conditions, oxygen deprivation and extreme temperatures could kill a person within hours. She tried to stay calm, reassuring herself that help would come sooner or later. But with each passing day, the hope of rescue was fading. One day, while Anna was looking out the plane window, she saw another plane in the distance. Her heart raced, and she shouted, trying to attract attention. But the pilot of the passing plane didn't see them. The chance was missed. Disappointment and despair overwhelmed her, but Anna tried not to show it to her children. Food was running out. By February 21, their supplies were so low that they had to survive on mountain snow. The snow didn't satisfy hunger or thirst, only creating an illusion of satiety. Anna recorded everything in her diary, which had become her only friend and solace in this cold world. She understood that they needed to conserve every crumb of food, but with each passing day, it was becoming increasingly difficult. The next day, the thing everyone feared most happened. On the morning of February 22, as the cold pierced through to the bone, little Valera, one of Anna's sons, died. It was a devastating blow for her, but she knew she had to hold on for the sake of her other son, Sasha. However, with each passing day, it became increasingly clear that their chances of survival were rapidly dwindling. Those first days after the crash were a true test of endurance for Anna and the other passengers. They began to realize that no one was coming to rescue them, and their survival depended entirely on their own efforts. But in the harsh mountains of the Pamirs, where every minute was precious, there was only one hope. A miracle that might pull them out of this nightmare. Several days had passed since Valera's death, and the condition of the plane's passengers was deteriorating rapidly. Their rational minds told them that their chances of survival were decreasing by the hour. Knyazhnichenko, Vycroft, and the other men knew that staying in place was a sure path to death. They realized that their tiny remaining rations wouldn't last long, and their only chance for survival was to try once again to find a way down. The decision to leave was not easy. Two remained with the wreckage of the plane, Anna and her young son, Sasha. The men understood that Anna and the child would not survive the arduous mountain journey. No one was willing to take responsibility for their lives on such a difficult trek. Therefore, it was decided that the men would leave alone while Anna and Sasha would stay behind, hoping for a miracle. Anna silently watched as the men prepared to depart. Deep down, she knew their chances of survival were minimal, but she kept a calm facade for Sasha's sake. He didn't fully understand what was happening and anxiously asked his mother when they would return home. Anna could only comfort him, not knowing what to say. On February 25, the men bid farewell to Anna and her son, promising to return for them as soon as they found people and brought help. Anna watched them until they disappeared over the snowy slopes. Inside, she felt a deep sense of anxiety and emptiness. She understood that they were now completely alone in the vast mountains, and their hope for rescue was diminishing with each passing day. For the first few days, Anna and Sasha continued to wait, hoping for a miracle. The food ran out, and they were left to survive on snow alone. Anna collected snow in cans and warmed it with her body, trying to melt the frozen water. Their lives had turned into a struggle for survival, and each new day brought only more disappointment. New entries appeared in Anna's diary, reflecting her despair and fear. "We're out of matches. We collect snow in cans and place them in the cabin by the window. The days are cold with wind. Even snowstorms, we haven't left the cabin. We're so hungry. We've started to think of eating, and we decided to cut a piece from Valera." These entries were filled with horror and hopelessness that gradually took over her mind. Each new day in the Pamirs became increasingly unbearable for Anna and Sasha. The bony fingers of the cold tightened around their hearts, and hunger increasingly overpowered their minds. In a desperate attempt to keep her sanity and protect her son from death, Anna invented games to distract him from the unbearable reality. But the days passed, and the food had long since run out. On the day when there wasn't a crumb left in their supplies, Anna, in a fit of despair, took a step that would forever change her life. She spent a long time thinking about what they needed to do to survive. Staring at the dead body of her younger son, Valera, Anna endured a torturous inner conflict. Revulsion and fear clashed with the animal instinct to survive. Her consciousness slowly sank into a fog as the thought of cannibalism became a real possibility. On February 28, Anna took the first horrific step. She cut a small piece from her deceased son's body and tried to swallow it, but it stuck in her throat. The thought pounded in her head. How can I eat my own son? But hunger and the fear of imminent death drove her to act against all moral principles and instincts. This maddening struggle with herself continued for several days. Each new morning brought fresh torment. Anna tried to hide her actions from Sasha, but her body and mind were slowly giving in under the pressure of physical and mental exhaustion. She understood that she was losing her sanity, but she had no other choice. Meanwhile, the men who had left the camp found help among the locals in the village of Matron. They were on the brink of life and death, suffering from severe frostbite and exhaustion. The villagers provided them with first aid, but none of the rescued men remembered the woman and child left behind in the mountains. Anna and Sasha were forgotten, abandoned to die in the harsh, icy wilderness. Several days passed before one of the rescued men, Knyazhnichenko, finally remembered those they had left behind. But even then, it was too late. The men who had returned to life were in no hurry to inform the local authorities about those still in the mountains. Their hearts and minds were filled with fear and guilt, but none of them dared to admit that they had abandoned their comrades to their fate. Weeks passed, and in the harsh, icy wilderness, Anna Gureeva and her son Sasha continued to fight for survival. Days blended into an endless sequence of suffering and despair. Each new sunrise brought more cold, hunger, and fear. They were alone in the vast snowy expanses, deprived of hope and support. Anna understood that the men who had left them had likely already reached civilization, but days went by and no one came back for them. Her mind was on the brink of complete collapse. She wrote in her diary, hoping that someday someone would read those lines and understand what they had endured. Her entries became increasingly chaotic, filled with fear and anguish. Each new day was a test for their bodies and minds. Anna tried to hold on for Sasha's sake, but her strength was fading. Sasha, still young and not fully aware of the horror of their situation, couldn't understand why they weren't being rescued, why the food had stopped appearing. He looked to his mother as the only source of warmth and protection, but she herself needed comfort and help. One day, as the wind howled around the walls of the plane, Anna realized that they were out of matches. Now they had no way to warm their freezing bodies. She tried to collect snow in cans and warm it with her body, but it was a pathetic attempt to sustain their dying lives. The snowstorms and winds gave them no respite, and each new day became increasingly harsh. Anna began to lose touch with reality. She often sat by the plane's window, staring into the snowy void as if hoping to see signs of life. But all around her was silence and icy emptiness. With each passing day, she sank deeper into despair, and her diary became a reflection of her mental breakdown. Meanwhile, in the warm safety of the village, the men who had abandoned Anna were recovering from their terrible journey. But they still hadn't told anyone about those they left behind in the mountains. The villagers who had helped them had no idea that there were still 2 more people struggling to survive in the snow, a mother and her son fighting for their lives. It wasn't until Nyazhnichenko, lying in the hospital, began to grasp the full weight of his guilt that he finally spoke up about those they had left in the mountains. The news that Anna and Sasha might still be alive hit like a bolt of lightning. But time had passed, and no one knew if they could survive such a long ordeal. In early May, when Anna Gureeva and her son's fate was finally remembered, a rescue expedition was organized. Time was relentlessly moving forward, and everyone understood that the chances of finding them alive were slim. But the expedition had to go forward, if only to retrieve the bodies and return them to their loved ones. Ivan Gureev, Anna's husband, took part in this expedition. He had already come to terms with the thought that he had lost his wife and son, but he couldn't refuse to join the search. In the past few months, he had managed to rebuild his life with another woman, even though less than 3 months had passed since his family's disappearance. Guilt and shame tormented him, but he couldn't just sit and wait, knowing that his wife and child might still be alive. The expedition slowly made its way through snowy passes and slopes. The people involved in the search were prepared for the worst. On the way to the crash site, they found the body of Zhukovsky, one of the men who had left Anna and Sasha behind. Zhukovsky had fallen off a cliff into an abyss while trying to find his way to safety. Next to his body were spent shell casings and an empty pistol. He had fired it, hoping to attract the attention of his comrades, but his cries for help went unanswered. When the expedition finally reached the crash site, they found the wreckage of the plane, now turned into a frozen monument of despair and pain. On what was left of the fuselage, surrounded by snow and wind, sat Anna. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes empty and exhausted from pain. When she saw her husband, she slowly turned her head and asked, as if nothing had happened, "Vanya, have you already remarried?" These words struck Gureev to the core. He couldn't believe that his wife, who had been through hell on earth, was still alive. But what shocked him even more was her reaction. It was as if she had expected this, as if she knew that he had already accepted her death and moved on. Anna didn't answer her husband's question about where Sasha was. She just silently pointed to the skull lying next to the plane. Those moments, filled with silence and pain, were the heaviest blow for everyone present. Anna was rescued, but her mind and soul were forever scarred by what she had endured. Anna Gureeva was saved, but the events that took place on the icy peaks of the Pamirs left an indelible mark on her soul. After being brought to safety, she was immediately placed under medical care. Her physical condition was dire, but even more concerning was the state of her mental health. Having gone through the hell of isolation, cold, and despair, Anna seemed to be in another world, disconnected from reality. The doctors did everything they could to restore her to a normal life, but her mind was deeply shaken. Anna was tormented by nightmares, haunted by the images of those terrifying days she spent in the mountain wilderness. Every time she closed her eyes, she was confronted with visions of snow, wind, and cold, devouring everything alive. The memories of how she had to take extreme measures to survive tormented her from within. She felt immense guilt for what she had done, but she knew that otherwise, she and Sasha would not have survived. This feeling of guilt tore her apart, giving her no peace day or night. Anna knew that no one could understand what she had gone through, and this sense of loneliness became unbearable. Rescuers and doctors avoided asking her questions about what had happened on the mountain. They understood that talking about the events too early might only worsen her condition, but Anna herself felt a need to tell her story, as if she hoped that confessing might wash away her sins and ease her soul. However, every time she tried to speak, the words stuck in her throat. She was tormented by the thought that her confession would cause horror and condemnation from others. Anna feared that she would be perceived as a monster, capable of the most dreadful acts. But even more, she feared judgment from herself, knowing she would never be able to forgive herself for what she had done. After a long period of treatment and rehabilitation, Anna Gureeva slowly began to return to life. She was transferred to a psychiatric hospital, where she spent several months under constant medical supervision. The doctors were amazed at her resilience and her will to fight, despite all the suffering she had endured. Anna tried to forget everything that had happened, but the memories persisted. She had to learn to live with them, accepting them as part of her new reality. Gradually, she began to find the strength to move forward. She met a man who was able to accept her for who she had become after all she had been through. He didn't ask about her past or try to draw out confessions. He was simply there, helping her build a new life. Anna remarried and had children, striving to create the life for them that she had once dreamed of giving her lost sons. She learned to appreciate every moment, understanding that happiness could be fleeting and fragile. Despite all the horrors she had endured, Anna managed to find joy in life again, though a shadow of the past always remained within her. Over the years, she learned not to dwell on what had happened in the Pamirs. She avoided contact with journalists and tried not to attract attention. There were no photographs of her after the disaster, and it was as if Anna had erased all traces of that time from her life, leaving only the memories she lived with in solitude. However, one unresolved question always lingered in her soul. Could she have acted differently? Could she have found another way to survive? These questions tormented her, but Anna tried not to seek answers. She understood that the truth was too bitter and too heavy to bear. Anna Gureeva lived a long life, reaching old age. She had children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, and on the surface, her life seemed successful. But those who knew her well understood that Anna always remained somewhat distant, immersed in her thoughts and memories. She never told her loved ones what had happened in the mountains. For her, it was like a forbidden topic, a wound that could not be touched. Her family respected this silence and didn't try to ask. They saw that Anna had found her place in life, and that was enough. Anna never returned to the site of the disaster and never flew on airplanes again. She tried to forget that her life had once been on the verge of ending on the snowy peaks of the Pamirs. But despite all her efforts, she could never completely rid herself of the shadows that followed her until the end of her days. Her story became known to only a few people, but those who knew about it remembered Anna as a woman who had gone through unimaginable trials and survived. Her fate was tragic, but at the same time, she was an example of the strength of the human spirit, which can endure even the harshest tests. Anna Gureeva lived to old age surrounded by family, but her eyes always remained sad. She lived a long life, but the shadows of the icy hell she experienced in the Pamirs never left her. Anna managed to return to life, but part of her soul was forever left among those cold peaks where she lost everything she held dear.